No one wanted to marry the orphan girl, until a poor rancher gave her his last name and claimed her.
Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Stone Hollow, Arizona Territory, autumn, 1882. The wind never stopped. It scraped against dry wood and shutter hinges, carried grit across the cracked roads, and stung the skin like a warning. Most of the buildings in town looked like they'd fall apart if anyone leaned too hard on them. The town had once hoped to become a proper stop on the cattle trail, but that dream had dried up like everything else around here. Rosalie Quinn, 25, stood in front of the church outbuilding with her arms wrapped tight around her chest. Her breath came out in short bursts. She'd just been turned out again. The preacher's wife had opened the door a crack, handed her a bundle of belongings wrapped in an old feed sack, and mumbled something about making room for the next one. Then the door shut, firm. No anger, no guilt, just done. She didn't argue. She never did. The sack held a folded blanket and a tin cup. That was all. She walked slowly down the porch steps barefoot, her feet stiff and bruised from days of wandering. The dress she wore clung to her full figure, sticking to the sweat between her thighs and beneath her bust. It was beige once. Now so faded and stained with dust, it looked gray in the late afternoon light. The low neckline was torn at the seam near her chest, exposing a shallow triangle of soft skin she couldn't quite hide without holding the fabric in place. Her hips shifted side to side when she walked, the hem brushing against her calves in uneven sways. Rosalie didn't think about beauty. She didn't have time to think about much anymore. She was trying to find shelter before dark. She didn't have family, didn't know where she was born. She'd been raised in bits and pieces. An orphanage in Tucson, then farm kitchens and church homes where she was expected to clean more than she was allowed to eat. Twice sent east as a mail-order bride, and twice returned, once because she didn't speak up enough, the second because she wouldn't lie down when asked. After that, Stone Hollow labeled her as unwanted, unwilling, maybe unwell. Rumors had weight in towns like this. 12 doors. That's how many she'd knocked on since yesterday. Each one a little further from the town square. Each one answered with a stiff face and a quiet refusal. Sometimes it was, "We don't have enough to share," or "Try the church." Once it was just a locked door and the shuffle of boots on the other side, pretending not to hear her. She was running out of places to go. It was getting cold. Across town, a man loaded fence posts into a wagon hitched to a mule. He worked slowly, methodically, like the weight of the world sat on his back, and he'd grown used to carrying it. His name was Evan Rourke, 39. He'd been in Stone Hollow for 7 years and had spoken fewer words than anyone could remember. Folks said he used to be a trail hand, ran cattle north with his younger brother, Paul. Both of them got caught in a stampede outside of Amarillo. Paul didn't survive. Evan came back changed, quieter, slower, like the noise inside him had been switched off. He bought a shack in 5 acres west of town with the last of his savings. Didn't ask for help. Didn't offer any. He showed up in town twice a month for salt and nails, paid in coin, and left without a word. Some folks said he wasn't right in the head. Others said he was grieving. But everyone agreed. He didn't bother anyone, and no one bothered him. That made him safer than most. Rosalie spotted him as she rounded the last building on the west side of town, her blanket sack slung over her shoulder and her toes numb. He had just finished tying down the last post. The mule stood still, patient and worn, like it had been doing this with him for years. She stopped a dozen paces away. He turned slowly when he heard the crunch of her steps. His eyes met hers, and he didn't look away, just stared, steady, taking in the smudges on her face, the torn dress, the tremble in her knees. He noticed the exposed cleavage too, but not with hunger, with awareness. He knew what this place had done to women like her. Rosalie's throat was dry. She didn't want to beg again. Not this time. But she also knew she had nowhere else to go. "I don't need charity," she said, her voice low and tight. "Just a place to sit a spell. I'll work." Evan didn't answer. He looked at her a moment longer, then shifted the rope strap over his shoulder and moved to the side of the cart. Without a word, he reached out his hand and offered it to her. She hesitated. Every time someone touched her, it had come with a price. But this man wasn't leering. His eyes were tired. His hand was steady, and the air was getting colder. She took his hand. It was rough and warm and didn't pull, just supported her weight as she climbed up into the wagon seat beside him. She sat down slowly, pulling the fabric of her skirt over her thighs and adjusting the neckline to cover herself as best she could. Her heart thudded in her chest, unsure if she had just made a mistake or saved her life. He climbed in beside her, clicked his tongue once. The mule started forward. Neither of them spoke during the ride west. The ruts in the road jostled the cart. Rosalie held the edge of the bench with both hands, stealing glances at the man beside her. He smelled like cedar smoke and leather. His arms were strong and scarred. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing deep lines in his forearms and hands so worn they looked carved. They arrived at a small rise near a dried creek. His shack stood crooked beneath a leaning cottonwood, patched together from weather-beaten wood and rusted tin. The porch had one rail. The door hung a little off-kilter, but there was smoke from the chimney, and that meant heat. Inside, it was small: one bed, a stove, a chair, and a table with a dented pot sitting on it. A pile of kindling rested in the corner. The air smelled like old ash and boiled beans. Evan lit a lantern, adjusted the wick, and set it on the table without speaking. Rosalie stood near the wall, her fingers curled around the edge of her skirt. She didn't know whether to sit, speak, or wait for instructions. He turned, pointed to the chair. She sat. He filled a dented kettle at the barrel by the door, hung it over the fire, and stirred the coals to life again. Then he knelt beside the bed and unrolled a spare blanket on the floor near the stove. He didn't touch her, didn't ask questions. She watched him, wary but confused. "Why?" she asked softly, her voice breaking just slightly. "Why were you letting me stay?" He met her eyes from across the firelight. His expression didn't change. He just nodded toward the floor mat, then the door, then her. It was clear. She could leave any time, but if she stayed, the mat was hers. No questions, no promises, no cost. Her shoulders slumped, not from defeat, but from release. She nodded. All right. That night, she curled up on the bed with the blanket drawn to her chin. The dress stuck to her skin, her legs cold despite the fire. She faced the wall, but kept one eye on him. He lay on his side, back to her, his breathing steady. She didn't sleep for a long time. She listened to the fire, to the wind, to the silence between them. And when she finally did fall asleep, it was the first time she hadn't dreamt of being turned away. Rosalie woke to the smell of wood smoke and the soft creak of footsteps near the stove. For a second, she didn't move. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the dim morning light cutting through a crooked window pane. The room was quiet but not cold, and for the first time in weeks, her back didn't ache from sleeping on uneven ground. Her body was sore but warm. The blanket hadn't slipped off during the night. She blinked, then turned her head. Evan was by the fire, crouched low. His back faced her as he fed kindling into the stove. The muscles in his shoulders moved beneath the faded fabric of his shirt, sleeves still rolled to the elbows, same as yesterday. His suspenders were off, tucked to the side, and his trousers looked as worn as everything else he owned. She could hear the scrape of the kettle being lifted and the faint bubble of water beginning to boil. Rosalie sat up slowly. The bed creaked under her, and Evan turned his head slightly, not fully, just enough to let her know he'd noticed. Then he looked away again and kept working. She wrapped the blanket around her chest, tugging it higher to cover where her dress was still torn. The fabric had slid down again overnight, exposing more of her chest than she realized. She adjusted it quickly, cheeks flushing. Not because she felt ashamed, she'd long passed shame, but because this man hadn't tried to look. And for some reason, that made her want to. "I didn't snore, did I?" she said, half awkward just to break the air. He didn't answer. Of course he didn't. Rosalie glanced around the cabin, properly seeing it for the first time. The walls were bare but clean. A shelf held a tin cup, a knife, a folded cloth, and a small iron pan. There were no signs of another person. Not a second chair, not a comb, not a woman's boot tucked under the bed. This was a man who had lived alone for a long time, and he still hadn't asked her who she was. "Rosalie," she said. "My name's Rosalie Quinn. I figured you ought to know." Evan didn't speak. He just stood and poured 2 cups of water, placing one on the table, then stepping back. She took it with both hands, still wrapped in the blanket. The heat bit at her fingers in a good way. Her lips pressed against the edge of the tin, and for a moment she said nothing more. She didn't know what to ask, or what to offer. "Thank you," she said softly. Evan gave a nod. It wasn't much, but it wasn't nothing. Outside, the wind had slowed. The sky looked pale through the window, streaked with cloud like the season was turning. She hadn't eaten since the day before, half a biscuit and whatever was left of a bruised apple. Her stomach cramped quietly beneath the blanket, but she didn't ask for food. Not yet. She sat near the table, watching Evan move. He cleaned the pan with a dry cloth, then took a piece of salted pork from a sack near the hearth and dropped it onto the heat. The crackle made her blink. He didn't ask if she was hungry. He didn't say the meat was hers. But he made enough for 2. She noticed his limp when he walked, slight but real, probably from an old injury. His left leg didn't bend the same way, and every few steps he favored the right. When he crouched, he did it slowly, deliberately. "What happened to your leg?" she asked gently. He paused, didn't answer, just gave a small shake of his head and turned back to the fire. Rosalie didn't press him. Still, that explained something. Why he worked alone. Why his fences looked patchy and the cart was overloaded yesterday. He didn't ask for help because people didn't offer it. Not anymore. And maybe he didn't care to be around folks who stared or asked questions. Just like her. When the food was ready, Evan placed the pan on the table and motioned once with his hand. She stood, blanket still wrapped tight around her, and sat across from him. They ate in silence. Rosalie didn't pretend she wasn't starving. She ate slow but steady, eyes down, careful not to look too eager. Evan ate with one hand, the other resting against the edge of the table like he was half-guarded, half-grounded. When the meal was done, he stood, took the plates, and walked to the wash basin without looking at her. Rosalie followed. "Can I help?" she asked. He didn't stop her, and that was enough. She washed. He dried. They didn't speak. By mid-morning, Evan was outside, loading the mule cart again. Rosalie sat on the porch step, her knees drawn up, dress pulled carefully over her legs, the blanket folded behind her. She'd tied her hair back with a scrap of cloth she found on a nail inside the cabin. It didn't look good, but felt like something. Like she wasn't just some cast-off girl in someone else's home. When Evan came back up the porch, he handed her a worn pair of boots, small enough to nearly fit. "Try 'em," he said quietly. It was the first thing he'd spoken. She stared at him, stunned. Not because of the boots, but because his voice was low, steady, and kind. Not soft, not empty, just sure. She took the boots without a word. They fit well enough. "Where are we going?" she asked. He shrugged. "Wood." She stood. For the rest of the day, they worked side by side. Rosalie didn't ask for details. He didn't explain. She hauled branches, stacked bundles, wiped her forehead with her sleeve, and felt sweat pool at the base of her spine. He cut with quiet precision, and she followed his lead. No one watched. No one judged. No one expected anything from her except the next task. And somehow, that was a kind of peace she hadn't known. That night, as the sun dropped low behind the hills and the wind picked up again, Rosalie washed her hands in the basin, dried them on her skirt, and stood quietly by the window while Evan re-stoked the fire. Her body was sore. Her dress clung in places she wished it wouldn't. But she felt human again. Not because she'd been fed, but because she'd been needed. Before they went to sleep, she looked at him and said, "You don't have to say anything. But if you want it gone tomorrow, I'll go." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he walked over to the bed, pulled an old blanket from the trunk at its foot, and draped it over the mat beside the stove, the same one he'd slept on the night before. And then he sat down on the floor, back to the wall, legs crossed, arms resting loosely on his knees. Rosalie climbed into the bed slowly. She didn't say goodnight. He didn't either. But when the firelight flickered low and the wind tapped at the glass, she looked toward him and whispered just loud enough to be heard, "I'd like to stay." He didn't answer, but he didn't move. And that silence felt like yes. The third morning came cold. Rosalie rose just after dawn, the room faintly blue in the early light. Evan was already outside. She heard the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood, steady and distant. She sat up slowly in the bed, running a hand through her tangled hair, then wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and crossed to the stove. The fire had burned low overnight but not out. He'd added logs before sleeping. She hadn't heard him do it. He hadn't woken her. But it meant something that she'd stayed warm while he lay beside the stove on the hard floor again. She added kindling and coaxed the coals back to life. This place was becoming routine. Not familiar yet, but repeatable. That mattered. Outside, the wind hadn't picked up yet. Just dry air and the sound of his axe. Measured, even like the man himself. She found a pan, poured water from the barrel, and started breakfast the way he had the morning before. He hadn't asked her to, but it felt right to try. When he stepped through the door 20 minutes later, his shirt clung to his chest from sweat. His hands were red with sap, fingers nicked, one palm lightly blistered. He didn't speak as he removed his boots and crossed to the basin. "Food's near done," she said. He nodded once, then turned on the spigot and rinsed his hands. She watched him work, every movement deliberate, controlled, no wasted energy. She realized then he had built his days like fences, task by task, post by post, to keep something, grief probably, from caving in. As they sat down to eat, Rosalie finally asked something that had been resting in the air for days. "Do you live here alone?" "Always." Evan didn't look up, but his jaw tightened slightly. "Yes," he said. "No wife?" Before, he hesitated. "No." She nodded. "I figured. You don't seem like a man who's used to talking." He didn't respond. A beat passed. Then Rosalie lifted her tin cup to her lips. "I wasn't always alone," she said quietly, "but I don't remember most of it. Orphan young, raised by different kinds of people, some better than others." He looked at her then, direct, unblinking. Not surprised, just listening. "Stone Hollow's my last stop," she continued. "There's nowhere left to send me." They made that clear. Evan didn't nod, didn't pity, just took it in. After breakfast, they fell into another day's rhythm. Fencing work at the north boundary, checking the water troughs, hauling firewood. She stayed close. Not because he asked, but because her body, worn and bruised, didn't want to be alone again. And because each thing he handed her, a post, a coil of wire, a wedge of bread, felt like a word he wasn't saying. In the afternoon, the silence was broken by a voice from the road. "Evan, you alive in there?" It was a man's voice. Loud, mocking. Evan's back stiffened as he stood. Rosalie watched from the porch as he set down the hammer and wiped his hands on his trousers. She saw a flicker of something, wariness, shame, in his face before he turned toward the path. A man on horseback approached, tall, grinning, dressed in cleaner clothes than anyone in town had a right to. Red-faced, bold. "Didn't think you took boarders," he called out with a smirk. His eyes fell on Rosalie, then lingered longer than they should have. "That her?" Evan didn't answer. The man dismounted, stepping closer. Heard about the girl got turned out of the church. Didn't expect to find her all set up here like some preacher's secret. Rosalie said nothing. Her chest tightened. Her hand stayed in her lap, but her knuckles had gone white. Evan's stance didn't change, but his fingers curled slightly at his sides. "Name's Clymer," the man said to Rosalie, tipping his hat. "Rory Clymer. I run stock out past the wash. Heard she's still unclaimed." He turned back to Evan. "You put your name down yet?" Evan didn't blink. "Go home. Just the skin," Rory said, laughing lightly. "Seems like waste is all. Pretty thing like her can't be too choosy." Evan stepped once, not quickly, but close enough that Rory stopped laughing. Rosalie noticed Evan's jaw now, tight, his nostrils flared. But he didn't touch the man, didn't raise his voice, just stood in front of him, taller by a full head. "You done?" Evan said, low and flat. Rory lifted his hands. "Hell, I was just saying. She's not yours to say anything about." The silence held. Rosalie felt it like a hook just behind her ribs. No one had ever said that before. Not like that. Rory finally backed off with a chuckle. "You always were a damn mystery, Rourke." He mounted his horse and trotted off. Evan didn't look back at her for a long moment. When he finally did, she stood. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to cause." "You didn't." He turned and walked past her, back into the cabin. She followed him in. Inside, He moved to the shelf and pulled down the old ledger he kept for cattle tags and seed orders. He opened it to the back and flipped to a blank page. "What are you doing?" she asked. He took the pencil stub from the windowsill and pressed it to the paper. Then in small, slow letters he wrote, "Rosalie Quinn Rourke." She stared at it, then at him. Her voice caught. "Why?" He met her eyes, so they stopped asking. She didn't speak. Couldn't. He closed the book, set it on the table, then went outside and started chopping wood again. Same rhythm, same distance. Rosalie stood in the doorway for a long time, holding the moment between her fingers like it might float away. No one had asked her to stay, but he had, without speaking, and this time it had weight. The sun dropped behind a ridge earlier than usual. Autumn had deepened overnight. The wind carried the bite of cold even before dusk settled, and the sky had taken on that pale, scraped tone that meant frost by morning. Rosalie brought in the last of the laundry, her fingers stiff, her arms pink from the cold water. She shut the door behind her with her hip and turned toward the fire, arms full of half-dry clothes. Evan was at the table, mending the broken hinge from the barn door with a nail and a strip of old leather. He'd been working since before daylight and said maybe 5 words the entire time. That wasn't unusual, but it sat heavier today. She placed the clothes near the stove and looked over at him. His shoulders were tense, brow furrowed, lips drawn tight. Not angry, but thinking hard. She'd seen it before. He went quiet like this after Clymer had come by 2 days ago, and she hadn't asked questions then. But tonight, she couldn't let it go. "Evan." He didn't look up. She stepped closer. "That man, Clymer. He came here like he had a claim. Why didn't you send word to town after that? Why not go write our names down properly?" He set the hinge down gently. Didn't respond at first. Then, because it's not their business what this is. Her heart sank a little, not because of what he said, but because she still wasn't sure what this was either. "And what is this?" she asked, quieter now. Evan looked up. His eyes weren't hard, just tired. He studied her face a long time before answering. "You're here," he said finally. You didn't have to stay." Rosalie held his gaze. "I didn't have anywhere to go." "You still don't," he said. "But you stayed." She nodded once, slowly. That was true. She stepped toward the table and sat across from him. The lantern between them flickered in the draft, casting shadows across his jaw, his hands, his lined shirt. His eyes dropped to the corner of her dress, torn still near the chest, even though she'd tried sewing it shut the night before. The rip kept opening again when she leaned or reached too far. She knew what it revealed. She didn't cover it. "I could mend that better," he said quietly, eyes flicking up again. "If you wanted." Her heart thudded once in her chest. "You never look unless I let you," she said. His face didn't change. She leaned forward a little. "You don't treat me like I'm broken, even though I've been left more times than I can count." "You're not broken," he said. Plain. Final. Rosalie looked away, her throat tightening. "I want to earn my place here," she said after a moment. "Not just be some problem you didn't ask for. You already have." He said it without pause, like it was simple truth. She stared at him. Something inside her cracked and reformed at once. She felt it like warmth behind her ribs. The silence stretched, and when she rose to take the clothes to the bed, she did it slowly, waiting, half wishing he would follow. He didn't, but when she bent to lay the folded shirt across the foot of the bed, she felt it, his hand lightly resting at her lower back. Not gripping, not pulling, just there. Rosalie straightened, heart pounding. She didn't move away. Evan's hand stayed for a beat longer, then slid off with care. She turned to him, inches between them now. The fire behind them made the space feel smaller. The room felt warm despite the chill outside. Her chest rose with each breath. His eyes were on her face, not her body. Her hands were loose at her sides. She stepped forward, just enough to press her chest against his. His hands didn't roam. They held her waist, steady, respectful. Her cleavage brushed his shirt front. His breath hitched barely. She could feel the restraint in him like a taut wire. He could have taken, but he didn't. "Do you want this?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "Or would just feel sorry for me?" He answered by leaning forward, not rushing, not rough, and brushing his lips against hers once. Warm, Firm. Real. Then again, deeper. Her hand went to his chest, not to push away, but to feel the beat beneath. It was racing. They broke apart slowly. She looked into his eyes. That was my first kiss that didn't feel owned, she whispered. That's not what this is, he said. I know. They stayed like that a long while. And when she finally pulled away, she smiled. Not wide, not girlish. Just honest. Evan stepped back and nodded toward the bed. It's yours. I know that too. Later that night, they lay in their separate places, she on the bed, he near the stove, but they faced each other. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. And for the first time since arriving, Rosalie didn't wonder if she'd still be welcome tomorrow. She knew. By the following week, the mornings had turned bitter. Rosalie stepped outside before the sun had fully cleared the hills. Frost crusted the grass, silvering the tops of fence posts and glazing the edge of the water trough with a thin, cracking skin. She wore one of Evan's old shirts over her dress now, the sleeves rolled high, the fabric too wide for her frame but warm. The neckline of her prairie dress still sagged, still torn slightly where it dipped low, but she no longer fidgeted to cover it. He never looked at her like the others had. And now, when he did look, she didn't turn away. Evan was already at the far end of the fence line, his coat slung over one post, hammer in hand. The cold didn't seem to touch him the way it did her, though she noticed his limp had grown slightly worse in the colder days. She watched the way he moved, slower, more deliberate. He'd said nothing about it, but she saw how he reached for the fence post with his right leg steady and his left trailing. There was something old in that wound, likely something permanent. Back inside the cabin, the stove crackled to life again. Rosalie stirred a pot of beans while cornbread baked in a skillet over the heat. The cabin smelled good. Like food. Like routine. Like a place that belonged to both of them now. Not just him. But hadn't always. And there were things unsaid still. Things the listeners might have wondered. Like, how had Rosalie survived before she came to Evan's door? Or, why hadn't anyone else in town helped her? She thought about that as she set the table. 2 tin plates, 1 knife, 1 fork, the second one lost long ago, and 2 cups. Before Stone Hollow, she'd been moved from one dry-eyed household to another. First taken in by a widow who needed a girl to scrub floors. Then passed to a family with too many children of their own. Finally sent off twice to men who'd sent for wives but didn't want women with voices or history. The first had touched her without permission. The second hadn't touched her at all, just sent her back, saying she didn't stir a man's appetite. After that, the town viewed her like stale bread, still around, but not something you'd serve to company. So when the preacher's wife put her out, no one had objected. And when Evan took her in, they whispered again. Maybe they still did, but Evan didn't seem to care. He just kept showing up every morning, doing what needed doing. Fixing things. Feeding livestock. Building with slow hands and long hours. That morning, when he returned from the fence line, his hands were raw from the cold and a nick on his thumb bled slowly. She made him sit by the fire and fetched a clean strip of cloth from the tin she'd organized days ago. Hold still, she said gently, crouching beside him. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Just watched her as she wrapped the cloth around his hand, her fingers moving carefully. You don't take care of yourself, she murmured. I'm not used to anyone doing it for me. Her hands paused. You're now, she said. Evan looked at her, eyes quiet but steady. You staying? She met his gaze directly. I haven't thought about leaving in days. That seemed to settle something in him. He relaxed slightly. His hand, still in hers, didn't move. They ate in quiet. Later, when she stepped out to sweep the porch, she noticed something else, new tracks in the dirt. Fresh boot prints, near the side of the cabin where no one had reason to walk. She crouched low and touched the edge of one. Too deep for her foot. Not Evan's either. Different tread. She looked toward the trees. Evan saw her standing still when he came out with the water bucket. What is it? She pointed. Someone's been by. Not long ago. He crouched beside her, studying the tracks. Climber? She asked. Maybe. Do you think he's watching us? Doesn't matter if he is. She looked at him. Why? Because I'm not ashamed. That night, Evan brought the old marriage ledger from the shelf and opened it again. The name he'd written earlier, Rosalie Quinn Rourke still sat clean and deliberate across the page. He took the pencil and pressed it beside the names. Then, without saying anything, he pushed the book across the table toward her. Rosalie looked down. She didn't need to be told what it meant. He wasn't proposing. He was making it real, claiming her not like a prize, but like a partner. She reached for the pencil. Her fingers were shaking. She added one line below his. I choose to stay. Then she looked up at him. I don't want a preacher. Or a paper. Evan nodded once. We don't need one. They didn't sleep apart that night. He didn't touch her like he owned her. He held her like she was home. The next morning, the bed still held her warmth when she woke, but Evan was gone. The sun hadn't cleared the trees yet, and the room was washed in cold blue light. Rosalie blinked slowly, adjusting to the quiet. She reached to the other side of the mattress, half expecting to find him still there. But all that remained was the faint scent of wood smoke and the shallow impression of his body. The stove was still burning. He'd fed it before leaving. Again, she sat up, pulled the blanket to her chest, and just sat there for a moment, listening to the fire crackle, the wind tapping the window, her own breath. Last night had changed something between them. Not because of what had happened. Though they had shared the bed, her body curled close to his under the same quilt, but because nothing had been rushed. Nothing had been taken. It was the first night in her life she had slept in a man's arms and not woken afraid. Rosalie stood, wrapped a shawl around herself, and stepped into the worn boots he'd given her. She dressed quickly, ran her fingers through her hair, and stepped outside. Evan was splitting wood again. His shirt was off this time, just suspenders and trousers, and the scar on his left shoulder caught the light as he swung the axe. She hadn't seen it before. A deep, pale mark that curved just above the rib cage, old and ragged. From a stampede? A fight? A fall? She approached slowly. You're up early, she said. He didn't pause his work. Didn't want to wake you. She hesitated. That scar, what happened? He set the axe down and looked at her, breathing hard. Stampede. 7 years ago. My brother didn't make it out. She stepped closer. I'm sorry. He nodded once, jaw tight. I was the one holding the reins. He was green. Should have been me instead. Rosalie reached out and rested her hand just beneath the scar. His skin was warm from the work, muscles firm beneath her touch. It wasn't your fault. He didn't answer, but he didn't pull away. Later, over breakfast, she noticed the lines around his eyes were heavier than usual. He wasn't angry, just heavy, pulled down by something he carried alone. So she spoke. I was told once that I wasn't worth keeping, by a man who sent me back like I was bad stock. Evan looked up, startled, not by what she said, but by the fact that she'd chosen to say it at all. Rosalie continued. I didn't argue. I just packed my bag and left. I'd gotten used to it, being someone people pass along like a broom or a broken saddle. She paused, stirring her coffee with the tip of her spoon. But when I saw your face that first day, standing by that mule cart, you didn't look at me like that. I didn't see someone to fix, he said. I saw someone who already knew how to stand. Their eyes held. That afternoon, while Evan went to check the west fence line, Rosalie walked to the well. She brought a pail and rope and took her time. It was quiet. Too quiet. Her shoulders tensed without knowing why. She lowered the bucket, heard the splash, then paused as a sound drifted through the air behind her. Footsteps. Not Evan's. Slow, measured, confident. She turned. Rory Clymer stood 10 paces away, a half grin on his face and a hand resting on the hilt of a riding crop looped through his belt. Didn't mean to scare you, he said, too casually. You're not supposed to be here. He raised his eyebrows. Didn't know Evan was taking visitors by appointment these days. Rosalie didn't move. Her hand stayed at her sides, one still wrapped around the rope of the well. Rory stepped closer. People in town are starting to talk again, wondering if maybe Rourke's keeping more than just cattle out here. You should leave. He looked at her more closely now, eyes drifting too low. You look good out here. Better fed. That dress, he gave a low whistle. I can see why he's keeping quiet. Rosalie's spine straightened. You should go. Rory stepped forward again. And that's when Evan's voice cut through the air. Low, sharp, and unmistakably close. She told you to leave. Clymer turned, startled. Evan stood at the edge of the trees, coat off, his fists clenched at his sides. His jaw was tight, shoulders squared. He didn't yell. He didn't draw a weapon. But his presence alone was enough. Rory took a step back, hands raised. Didn't mean trouble. Just saying hello. You've said enough. Evan walked past Rosalie and stopped just inches from Rory. Next time you come near her, he said, voice flat, I'll put you down in the dirt and save the preacher's sermon. Rory's smile cracked, then faded altogether. He backed away, eyes flicking between them. He left without another word. Evan didn't speak for a moment. He just stood there, breathing slow and steady. Then he turned to her. You all right? She nodded, though her hands still trembled. He stepped close, took the pail from her hand, and set it aside. Then, gently, he cupped the back of her head and pulled her forward until her forehead rested against his chest. You don't have to be brave here, he said. You just have to be. Rosalie pressed her cheek to his skin and let herself breathe. Long, deep, real. And that night, she folded her old dress and tucked it beneath the bed. Evan handed her a new one, sewn by hand, plain but clean. The neckline modest, the skirt whole. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers. The next morning, she wore it to town beside him. And when people looked, they didn't see an orphan anymore. They saw Mrs. Rourke. The ride into town was quiet. Rosalie sat beside Evan on the cart bench, her hands folded in her lap, the soft brown fabric of her new dress fluttering lightly at her knees. Her hair was tied back with a strip of linen. The morning air was cold, but she kept her chin up as they passed the ridge and dipped into the valley where Stone Hollow lay. Evan hadn't said much when she asked to come along, just nodded once and helped her into the cart. He could tell it mattered to her. She hadn't set foot in town since being put out of the church cabin, not since she'd been turned away like worn-out bedding. And now she was coming back, not escorted, not begging, but riding beside a man who stood beside her like he had nothing to prove and no one to please. But Rosalie felt the weight of it all anyway. She could already imagine the stairs. They crossed the main road by the blacksmith shop, the same one she'd once swept for coin before they stopped calling her back. Children chased a stick hoop past the dry goods store. Two women on the porch of the tailors stopped their mending and whispered into their hands. At the post office, Evan tied up the mule while Rosalie stayed seated. She could feel eyes on her from every direction, not loud or cruel, just watchful, suspicious. When he returned with a parcel of flour and a few nails, she caught his sleeve. You don't have to stand for me, she said, her voice low. You don't owe me that. He looked at her, unreadable. I'm not standing for you, he replied. I'm just not leaving you behind. They stopped at the mercantile next, and Evan let her choose what they needed. He didn't question the soap, the thread, or the small comb she touched briefly before setting it back on the shelf. He picked it up without a word and added it to the pile. Back on the street, they passed Reverend Morgan, who stood outside the chapel's back building with his hands behind his back. He nodded curtly. Mr. Rourke. Miss Quinn. It's Rourke now, Evan said flatly. The preacher blinked. I see. Rosalie held her ground, even as a cold flush moved through her chest. But Evan's presence was enough. No more needed saying. They left without lingering. By the time they got home, the sky was hazy with low clouds, and the air smelled faintly of smoke from somewhere downwind. Winter was coming in faster than expected. That afternoon, they worked side by side again. Evan patched the lean-to roof. Rosalie stitched new seams into their worn bedding. At one point, she stood in the doorway and watched him from behind, how his shoulders moved under the weight of the hammer, how his limp slowed him but didn't stop him. She felt something strange then, something quiet but full. Pride. That evening, after the fire had settled low and the air inside the cabin was thick with the scent of warm cornmeal and ash, Rosalie stood beside the table, brushing her hair out with a new comb. She caught Evan watching her from the chair. He didn't look away. You keep doing that, she said, smiling faintly. He set down his tin cup. Doing what? Looking like you're waiting for something to go wrong. He didn't deny it. I don't trust good things anymore, he said simply. Didn't think I have another one. She crossed the room, bare feet soft on the wood floor. Her dress brushed her calves, and when she stopped in front of him, he tilted his head back to meet her eyes. You don't have to wait, she whispered. It's already here. Evan reached for her slowly, his hands resting on her waist. She stepped forward, straddling his lap, her hands resting on his shoulders. They kissed again, longer this time, deeper. Her body softened against his, her lips brushing over his with hunger and certainty. She felt his arms tighten, just enough to pull her closer, but not enough to control. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead to his. Evan, yeah, if you want me here for good, just say so. He didn't answer immediately. Then, with the same quiet certainty he always carried, he said, stay. She closed her eyes. I already did. That night, they shared the bed again, not just for warmth, not just for comfort, but because it was no longer his or hers. It was theirs. And for the first time since she was a child, Rosalie dreamt of a home that didn't vanish in the morning. By early December, the sky over Stone Hollow stayed gray for days at a time. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but the air was colder, the kind that got into your joints and stayed there. At night, wind creaked through the gaps in the cabin walls. Evan had been sealing the drafts with whatever he could find, scraps of burlap, folded cloth, dried mud. Rosalie stitched small patches into their quilts by lamplight, sometimes humming without realizing it. They had grown into the space together, slowly but without pause. One habit at a time, one small gesture layered over another. She folded his shirts differently now. He left the tin cup warm by the stove for her in the mornings. The silence between them no longer asked questions, it answered them. Still, something lingered in the quiet that night. Evan sat at the table, sharpening his old knife. Rosalie sat nearby, sorting dry beans into a shallow wooden bowl. She paused mid-motion. Evan, she said, soft but firm, do you ever think about starting over? He looked up. Not running away, she clarified, just starting fresh. A name that doesn't make people whisper. A place where no one remembers who didn't want us before. Evan set the knife down, edge glinting in the firelight. I thought that's what we were doing here. We are, but it still feels like surviving, not living. He didn't respond right away, just rubbed his thumb along the edge of the blade, thoughtful. I was content before you showed up, he finally said. Not happy, but content. I didn't expect more. She watched him. Do you want more now? He looked up. Do you? Rosalie nodded. Yes. Not more things. Just more days like this. Without looking over my shoulder. Without wondering when it ends. Evan stood, crossed to the trunk by the bed, and pulled out a rolled canvas. He hadn't touched it in weeks. He unwrapped it slowly and spread out on the table. A hand-drawn map. Pencil markings across the page. Water lines. Fence routes. And a red circle around the northwest corner of their land. I was going to fence this before winter, he said. It's rough land, but better soil than here. Could plant something come spring. Rosalie stepped closer, hands bracing the edge of the table. You never told me. I didn't think I'd need help before. Now I do. Her throat tightened, not from sadness, but from being trusted. Then we start tomorrow, she said. The next morning, frost clung thick to every post, every plank of wood. Their breath clouded as they hauled lumber and supplies down to the far edge of the land. The corner Evan had marked sat against a low rise, shielded on one side by rock and on the other by thin cottonwoods. The soil there was darker, richer, untouched by cattle hooves or fire. It felt like a beginning. They worked in silence. Rosalie helped hold fence rails while Evan nailed. Her fingers numbed fast, but she didn't complain. Evan showed her how to brace the posts with stones, how to check for slope in the ground. At one point, when she slipped in the mud and fell onto her side, he reached down and pulled her up without a word. His hand stayed on her hip a beat too long, but she didn't mind. She leaned into it. Then they got back to work. By noon, they had 2 corners set. By late afternoon, Rosalie's hands were blistered and her arms ached, but something inside her felt steadier than ever. They sat on a cut log and shared a tin of bread and beans, their backs warm against the sun. She looked over at him, the light catching in his unshaven jaw, sweat on his collarbone, hands rough and stained from labor. A man made of work, not talk. Why did you let me in? She asked quietly. He took a breath, slow. You didn't ask for anything, he said. You just stood there like you had nowhere else to fall. I didn't. That's why I opened the door. She smiled faintly. And why'd you keep me? He looked at her. eyes calm and steady. Because you stayed. That night, they didn't light the lamp right away. They just sat on the edge of the bed, shoulder to shoulder, boots still on, watching the fire ease down to coals. Rosalie reached for his hand and placed it low over her belly, then rested hers atop his. "I miss my time," she said. Evan didn't speak. He didn't flinch. He just turned slowly to her, searching her face. "Are you sure?" She nodded once. "Not completely, but I know what my body feels like now. I've never been regular, but I've never gone this long without. And I've never felt like this either." Evan held her gaze, then looked down at their joined hands. "Does it scare you?" she asked. He nodded once. "Yeah." She smiled. "Me too." Then softer, but not in a bad way. Evan leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers. "We'll make a place for it," he whispered. "Here, with us." And that night, as they lay in bed, her back to his chest, his arm draped protectively over her waist, they didn't talk about the town, the past, or the men who once left her behind. They just breathed together, steady and quiet, because now there was more than just survival. There was future. The snow came in early January, quiet, slow, relentless. By dawn, the ridge behind the cabin had turned white, and drifts gathered at the door. Inside, the fire was already crackling. Evan had risen before Rosalie, like always, stoking the coals and setting a kettle to boil before the cold reached her bones. She sat up slowly, both hands resting instinctively on her belly. It had been nearly 3 months now. No question about it anymore. Her cycle hadn't come. Her body had softened, thickened in places. And sometimes when she placed her palm just below her navel and lay still, she thought she could feel something faint, some tiny flutter of life. Not yet movement, but not just her either. Evan didn't talk much about the baby, but he worked harder than ever. Built a proper cot out of leftover pine, reinforced the roof, even walked the 2-day trail to Crescent Ridge for more supplies without saying a word. Just left one morning before sunup and returned covered in snow with blankets, tin bowls, and a wrapped parcel containing a clean white bonnet. He never explained the bonnet, just left it on the shelf near the bed. Now, as the storm thickened outside, Rosalie moved slowly through the cabin, folding laundry, keeping the stew pot warm, pausing now and again to press her hands into the small of her back when it ached. Her breasts were tender, her balance slightly off, but Evan always noticed. If her breath caught while bending down, he was there before she asked. If her boots were wet, they were dried and near the stove before the next day. She had never lived with a man who noticed without being told. One afternoon, the wind was howling hard against the western wall, rattling the windows. Rosalie stood in the center of the room, watching Evan patch a crack near the sill with a cloth-wrapped wedge of wood. "I've been thinking," she said. He paused, eyes flicking up. "If it's a girl, I want to name her after your brother." Evan blinked slowly. "Pauline," she added. "Paul, but gentle." He stood there for a moment, face unreadable, then turned away. She thought he might reject it. Too painful, too close. But when he returned to the table a moment later, he placed a small carving in her hand. A wooden bird, unfinished, just started. "I was carving that for her already," he said. They didn't speak for a long while after that. They didn't need to. Weeks passed. They rarely went into town. Snow kept them close to the hearth, close to each other. Rosalie's belly began to show clearly now, her dresses altered to fit by hand. Evan began sleeping lighter, waking at any odd noise, checking the windows more often, as if the child had already arrived and needed guarding. Then one morning, a letter came. The post rider delivered it with a gloved hand and a wide-eyed stare, surprised to see her open the door herself. She took the folded envelope and shut the door behind her before he could ask questions. Inside, she opened it beside the stove while Evan mended a bridle. It was from Reverend Morgan. A line or two, no more, written in formal pen. "Mr. Rourke, in light of the town's recent change of heart and your wife's honorable conduct, we hereby recognize your union as proper and binding. If you wish to formalize it through the church, the offer remains open. Sincerely, Reverend Morgan." She read it twice, then handed it silently to Evan. He read it once, snorted softly, and handed it back. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Rosalie smiled. Nothing. He nodded, pleased. Good. That spring, the land thawed slow and stubborn. But the corner of soil Evan had marked, where they planted rye and carrots and wild beans, grew green faster than the rest. Rosalie stood barefoot in the patch one morning, her belly full and high, one hand on her lower back, the other shading her eyes as she looked over the field. Evan walked up behind her, slid an arm around her waist, rested his chin gently on her shoulder. She leaned into him. They'll ask questions again. Once she's born, she said. They'll want papers, dates, proof. Let them ask. And if they say she shouldn't carry your name, Evan didn't answer immediately. Then, they can say what they want. She's already mine. That night, as dusk settled into the hills and coyotes barked far off in the brush, Rosalie lit the lamp and placed the carved wooden bird on the windowsill. Pauline, she whispered, brushing dust from its wings. You're coming into a world that never made room for folks like us. She looked toward the bed, where Evan was folding the last of the linens, his brow furrowed in concentration, lips moving faintly as he counted seams. But we carved one anyway. She pressed a hand to her belly. And you'll never be unwanted, not even for a second. Outside, the wind had quieted. Inside, the stove burned low and steady. Their home stood firm, not because it was built well, but because the people inside had chosen, day after day, to stay. Not out of obligation, but out of love.